The past never stays buried. It waits, dormant in locked vaults, sealed envelopes, and burned archives, until fragments resurface to challenge the foundations of our world. Beneath the accepted history of the Second World War lies a darker, more disturbing reality. 5 secrets so dangerous they were buried deliberately, silenced by governments, intelligence services, and those who stood to lose everything if the truth were known. These were not rumors, not exaggerations, but files marked "for eyes only," stamped with codenames, concealed under treaties and erased from official memory. What emerges is a forbidden chronicle. Nazi nuclear ambitions on the brink of ignition, Soviet laboratories harvesting Japan's atrocities, Allied betrayal of resistance fighters written out of victory narratives, Vatican corridors entangled in silent pacts with the Reich, and Japanese surrender proposals ignored, drowned beneath the thunder of atomic fire. Each fragment is grave, urgent, and unresolved. What follows is not speculation, but the whispered record of declassified archives and missing testimonies. This is the story of secrets so volatile, their disclosure could fracture alliances, destabilize governments, and collapse nations. The war ended in 1945, but the shadows it cast still linger, stretching into our present with consequences we may never fully escape. Chapter 1. Classified Nazi nuclear ambitions erased. The ruins of the Third Reich conceal truths more dangerous than any battlefield victory. For decades, the accepted narrative held that Nazi Germany's atomic project was a scattered, ineffective endeavor, more theater than reality. Yet declassified fragments of Operation Alsos, the Allied mission to capture German nuclear assets, suggest otherwise. In dimly lit vaults beneath Austria's mountains and the forests of Thuringia, scientists loyal to the Reich pursued a weapon that, if completed, could have rewritten the end of the war. Evidence seized in April 1945 points to uranium oxide stockpiles, precision centrifuge prototypes, and documents marked with the chilling codename Uran Project. These files were swiftly removed, sanitized, and locked away, not because they were unimportant, but because they hinted that Hitler's regime stood dangerously close to a weapon of unimaginable destruction. Allied intelligence teams fanned out through bombed cities and abandoned laboratories. Led by Colonel Boris Pash and scientific advisor Samuel Gaudsmit, their orders were explicit: find the scientists, confiscate the materials, destroy any trace that might fall into Soviet hands. They uncovered shipments of heavy water smuggled from Norway, blueprints for reactor vessels hidden in barns, and even the remnants of experimental test sites. In the small town of Haigerloch, investigators discovered a cave laboratory, complete with a reactor core suspended by chains, encased in graphite, surrounded by barrels of heavy water. Though primitive by modern standards, its very existence contradicted the myth that German science had lagged hopelessly behind. Testimonies from captured researchers revealed that experiments had advanced to the brink of achieving criticality. Among these scientists was Werner Heisenberg, Nobel laureate and one of the most enigmatic figures in 20th century physics. Heisenberg's role remains shrouded in controversy. Was he deliberately stalling progress, or had he in fact led his team closer to success than the Allies dared admit? Transcripts from Farm Hall, where German physicists were secretly recorded after the war, captured their stunned reaction to news of Hiroshima. Heisenberg's initial disbelief quickly turned to technical recalculations, suggesting not ignorance, but suppressed awareness of how close his own team had come. When Heisenberg reconstructed the principles of a bomb within days, it left Allied interrogators uneasy. Had they been moments away from confronting a Nazi atomic detonation? Even darker were survivor testimonies collected years later from forced laborers conscripted into these projects. Prisoners spoke of unexplained illnesses, of workers collapsing with bloody lesions and burned skin, of faint blue glows emanating from experimental chambers. These accounts, dismissed at the time, now bear the hallmarks of radiation poisoning. The Nazi program may never have completed a deliverable weapon, but it flirted with processes that killed without bullets or bombs. If true, then human lives had already been sacrificed at the altar of atomic ambition. After the collapse of the Reich, American forces swept these findings into secrecy. Shipments of uranium were quietly loaded onto US Navy vessels and delivered to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, bolstering America's Manhattan Project at its most critical stage. Operation Paperclip, though often remembered for rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun, also extended to nuclear specialists whose research was deemed too valuable to destroy. The Soviets, too, scoured occupied zones, retrieving fragments of reactors, notebooks, and surviving technicians. A new war, the Cold War, was already beginning, and the knowledge of how close Hitler had come became a weapon of silence, too dangerous for public consumption. Why erase this truth? The answer lies in legitimacy. To admit that the Allies barely outpaced the Nazis in the race for atomic supremacy would shatter the moral narrative of decisive superiority. To acknowledge that Hitler's scientists nearly unleashed nuclear fire would ignite fear, panic, and distrust in governments that claimed to have protected their citizens from such peril. Worse still, the revelation might embolden new generations of extremists who could portray the Reich not only as militarily formidable, but scientifically prophetic. The documents that remain are fragmented, often redacted, and scattered across archives in Washington, London, and Moscow. Yet patterns emerge. Coded references to uranium shipments labeled as medical supplies, unexplained construction budgets in SS-controlled regions, and destroyed facilities wiped from post-war maps. Historians who probed too deeply into these shadows found themselves confronted with sealed files and missing evidence. Even today, requests under Freedom of Information laws return pages of black ink, reminders that some truths remain classified, hidden beneath the weight of their consequences. The idea that Nazi Germany came within reach of the atomic threshold is not merely academic. It challenges the bedrock of post-war order, raises questions about Allied integrity, and undermines the mythology of inevitable victory. If the Reich had bought only a few more months, if its laboratories had not been bombed, if its scientists had been fully resourced, the world might have witnessed a Nazi detonation on a European battlefield. The spectre of that possibility, once whispered in intelligence briefings, was deemed too destabilizing for global consciousness. And so the story was rewritten. The failures were emphasized, the successes erased, and the dangerous proximity of nuclear Armageddon buried under triumphalist narratives. Yet the shadows of Haigerloch, of Thuringian caves and Austrian bunkers refused to vanish. Every rediscovered fragment, every testimony, every declassified page pulls the past closer to the present. The war ended, but the silence continues, guarding a secret too heavy for the victors to admit, that Hitler's Reich, though defeated, stood far nearer to nuclear devastation than the world was ever told, and perhaps nearer still than we are prepared to accept even now. Chapter 2: Forbidden Soviet Experiments in Manchuria. When the Soviet Red Army stormed into Manchuria in August 1945, their objective was not only to crush the remnants of the Kwantung Army, but also to seize something far more sinister: the living legacy of Japan's infamous Unit 731. Officially, the Soviet Union celebrated its victory as a triumph over imperial militarism. Unofficially, Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, was already dismantling laboratories, transporting records, and interrogating men who had committed crimes so abhorrent they were beyond comprehension. Declassified fragments from the Khabarovsk war crimes trial of 1949 reveal only glimpses of what Moscow uncovered, but the true scale of the horror was buried under classified orders marked Osoboy Vazhnosti, of special importance. What was transported out of Manchuria was not only documents, but pathogens, research equipment, and the very architects of atrocity, repurposed for the Soviet state. Unit 731, headquartered near Pingfang, had been the epicenter of biological warfare experiments for years. Prisoners, referred to coldly as logs, were subjected to frostbite exposure until their limbs cracked like glass. Others were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, or cholera, dissected alive without anesthesia, and catalogued in meticulous detail. Testimonies confirm that Japanese scientists perfected methods of dispersing pathogens through ceramic bombs, and tested these weapons on entire villages in northern China. When the Soviets arrived, they encountered laboratories filled with preserved organs, cages of infected animals, and underground chambers designed for controlled outbreaks. Instead of burning the evidence, Moscow seized it. Within weeks, specialized convoys were seen moving crates marked with cryptic designations westward, across Siberia, towards secret facilities near Khabarovsk and Novosibirsk. The rationale was brutally pragmatic. Stalin understood that biological warfare was the next frontier of military supremacy. American forces, through secret deals, were already extracting data from Unit 731 scientists in exchange for immunity. the Soviets could not allow themselves to fall behind. Major General K.I. Smirnov, head of Soviet biowarfare programs, oversaw the integration of Japanese expertise into Soviet research. Files declassified in the 1990s reveal references to Operation Kwantung, a program dedicated to weaponizing knowledge obtained from captured Japanese doctors. Unlike the Americans, who claimed moral distance by suppressing public awareness of Unit 731, the Soviets showcased select war criminals in the Khabarovsk trials. Yet these trials themselves were carefully staged, exposing only fragments while shielding the broader transfer of expertise into Soviet laboratories. What remains most disturbing are the reports of field tests conducted under Soviet control. Accounts from defectors and rumors whispered among Cold War intelligence officers suggest that entire Siberian villages may have been exposed to weaponized pathogens, monitored under strict secrecy, and then erased from official records when outbreaks spiraled. Declassified CIA memoranda from the early 1950s noted unexplained plague clusters in border regions, coinciding with the presence of Soviet military units linked to biological research. Whether these were natural occurrences or controlled experiments remains unresolved. The very possibility that Moscow continued Japan's atrocities under its own authority casts a chilling shadow across Cold War history. Equally haunting are the unanswered questions about the fates of Unit 731's key scientists. Men such as General Shiro Ishii, who orchestrated the horrors, were never tried in Soviet courts. Some were interrogated, extracted for their knowledge, and then disappeared from public record. Soviet archives refer obliquely to technical advisors relocated to research institutes, their identities concealed. It is possible that Japanese war criminals, officially condemned, were secretly absorbed into Soviet programs much as others were by the United States. If so, then the victims of Manchuria were sacrificed twice, once to Japanese experimentation, and again to the Cold War calculus that placed power above justice. The Khabarovsk trials themselves remain a contested chapter. Western observers at the time dismissed them as propaganda, unwilling to believe the Soviets' detailed accounts of biological atrocities. Only decades later, when Japanese archives and testimonies confirmed Unit 731's crimes, did it become clear that the Soviets had been telling more truth than the world wished to accept. Yet what they omitted was even more revealing. There was no mention of Soviet possession of Japanese research, no reference to ongoing experiments, no acknowledgement of secret transfers of pathogens. Those silences speak louder than the confessions. They suggest deliberate concealment, a rewriting of the record to ensure that the world never fully grasped the scale of knowledge Moscow had harvested. The legacy of these forbidden experiments reverberates even now. International conventions banning biological weapons emerged in part from the shadows of Manchuria, yet enforcement remains fragile. Rumors persist of Soviet-era stockpiles, hidden deep within Siberian vaults, containing strains first cultivated in Japanese laboratories. Some of these pathogens, engineered for resilience, may still exist, dormant but intact. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 raised fears that such weapons could fall into uncontrolled hands, a nightmare scenario rooted in decisions made in 1945. The biological secrets carried from Manchuria did not vanish. They became part of a clandestine arms race that shaped global security for decades. The most disturbing truth is that ordinary citizens, villagers in China, prisoners of war, political dissidents, were reduced to raw data, their suffering transmuted into state secrets. Their stories were erased, their deaths rationalized in the pursuit of power. Today, scattered memorials in China stand as reminders of Unit 731's atrocities, but the Soviet chapter remains buried. Access to Russian military archives is restricted, and files that might confirm the extent of Operation Kwantung are classified indefinitely. The silence is deliberate, calculated, and dangerous. If revealed in full, these secrets could destabilize international agreements, fracture the moral legitimacy of post-war powers, and reopen wounds that never truly healed. The horrors of Unit 731 were not confined to Japan's empire. They were carried westward, concealed within Soviet vaults, and woven into the fabric of Cold War rivalry. What remains is a chilling reminder. The line between victor and criminal blurs when power, secrecy, and survival converge. And in the forests of Manchuria, beneath the frost and shadows, the ghosts of those experiments still linger, demanding a reckoning that has yet to come. Chapter 3: Hidden Allied Betrayal of Resistance Movements. The mythology of the Second World War celebrates the Allies as liberators, defenders of freedom who rallied the occupied nations of Europe to rise against tyranny. Yet buried within declassified OSS and SOE archives lies a story that undermines this triumphant narrative. A pattern of betrayal, abandonment, and deliberate sacrifice of resistance fighters who believed they were fighting for liberation. These betrayals were not the result of miscommunication or battlefield chaos, but calculated political decisions, executed in silence and erased from public history. The victims were resistance networks scattered across Poland, France, the Balkans, and beyond, who paid with their lives for the fragile balance of post-war diplomacy. One of the most damning cases was the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. The Polish Home Army, loyal to the government in exile in London, launched a desperate revolt against German occupation, believing Allied support was imminent. For 63 days they fought, holding districts of the city, waiting for weapons and reinforcements promised in coded transmissions. But the aid never came. Declassified British files reveal that Prime Minister Winston Churchill urged supply drops, yet the requests were blocked by Joseph Stalin, who refused to allow Allied planes to use Soviet airfields. The Soviets, positioned just across the Vistula River, watched as the uprising was crushed, allowing the Germans to massacre tens of thousands and level the city block by block. The calculated delay ensured that non-communist resistance forces were annihilated, clearing the way for Soviet domination of post-war Poland. London and Washington, aware of this political calculus, chose silence, sacrificing their allies in the name of preserving relations with Moscow. France's resistance networks, too, bore scars of selective support. SOE operatives parachuted into occupied territory, supplying communist-affiliated cells, while withholding aid from Gaullist groups considered politically inconvenient. The Cold War was already taking shape within the resistance, long before the war itself ended. In Yugoslavia, British intelligence deliberately shifted support from royalist Chetniks to communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito, despite intelligence reports of partisan reprisals against civilians. By war's end, these choices ensured communist control of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, decisions that shaped the geopolitical map for decades. The betrayed resistance fighters were written out of official histories, their sacrifices minimized, their movements smeared as ineffective or unreliable. What they truly represented was politically inconvenient courage, men and women, whose survival threatened Allied diplomatic strategy. The depth of this betrayal is illuminated by post-war testimonies of survivors. Polish couriers who escaped the Gestapo brought with them documents showing repeated pleas for Allied support that were ignored. French resistors recalled the bitterness of being told to hold out for reinforcements that never came. In Greece, the Eddies resistance group was starved of supplies while the communist ELS received airdrops, tipping the balance of power toward a bloody civil war after 1945. OSS reports now available in US archives detail how decisions were made not on the basis of battlefield necessity but on calculations of post-war influence. These were not errors. They were deliberate sacrifices made to secure ideological dominance in the New World Order. Perhaps the most chilling evidence lies in the internal memoranda of Allied intelligence. In one report dated September 1944, an SOE officer acknowledged that continued resistance is of little strategic value, yet serves to weaken German reprisals upon us. The words condemn entire movements to annihilation, reducing men and women to expendable assets in a larger political chess game. Betrayal was not accidental. It was policy. Why were these betrayals hidden for so long? The answer lies in the construction of the post-war myth. The Allies needed a clean narrative of unity, sacrifice, and triumph. Admitting that resistance fighters were abandoned for political reasons would fracture that narrative, undermining the legitimacy of liberation governments and eroding trust in Western leadership. Instead, official histories emphasize the heroism of the resistance while omitting the duplicity of their supposed allies. Survivors who spoke out were silenced, their testimonies dismissed as bitterness or revisionism. The reality remained buried in classified files, accessible only to intelligence officers and historians decades later. The cost of these betrayals extended beyond wartime deaths. They reshaped nations. Poland emerged not as a liberated ally, but as a Soviet satellite, its independent fighters annihilated. Yugoslavia fell under Tito's iron rule, its monarchy exiled. Greece descended into civil war, tearing itself apart with weapons first dropped in the name of liberation. France's political landscape hardened, its resistance divided by memories of unequal support. Each of these outcomes was tied not only to battlefield victories, but to deliberate betrayals hidden beneath the surface of Allied policy. Even now, the release of declassified documents provokes controversy. Nations struggle to reconcile their celebratory myths with the grim reality that some of their bravest patriots were condemned by their allies. The Warsaw Uprising remains a wound in Polish memory, a reminder that their faith in Western promises was repaid with silence. French archives continue to conceal sensitive SOE files, their release delayed to protect reputations. The betrayal of resistance movements was not a footnote. It was a defining strategy of the war's endgame, shaping the Cold War order that followed. To acknowledge these truths is to challenge the foundations of Allied legitimacy. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the line between ally and adversary was blurred by political necessity. Resistance fighters were not only betrayed by occupying forces, but by those who claimed to be their liberators. Their stories remain a testament to courage, but also to the darkness hidden beneath the myths of victory. And if revealed fully, these hidden betrayals would fracture alliances still celebrated today, reopening wounds the world has never allowed itself to heal. Chapter 4. Disturbing Vatican Pacts with the Reich. Amidst the ruins of bombed-out cities and battlefields drenched in blood, one institution remained standing, untouched by fire or rubble: the Vatican. Its domes and courtyards, seemingly protected by divine providence, concealed something far darker than neutrality. Buried within diplomatic cables, secret memoranda, and post-war intelligence reports lies a disturbing truth: clandestine pacts between the Holy See and the Third Reich. These arrangements, crafted in whispered meetings and exchanged letters, ensured the preservation of the Church's influence while turning a silent eye toward atrocities committed across occupied Europe. For decades, the Vatican's wartime role has been cloaked in ambiguity. Yet fragments of evidence declassified by Allied intelligence paint a far more troubling picture. Complicity, concealment, and quiet cooperation with Hitler's regime. The roots of this shadowy relationship trace back to the Reichskonkordat of 1933, a treaty signed between Nazi Germany and the Vatican, ostensibly designed to protect Catholic rights within the Reich. It granted Hitler international legitimacy at a critical moment. Declassified OSS analyses from the early 1940s noted that the Vatican hierarchy was keenly aware of the risks, but chose compliance to safeguard its institutions. In practice, the treaty silenced Catholic political opposition in Germany, allowing Hitler to consolidate power without interference from one of Europe's most influential institutions. While Catholic priests and laypeople were persecuted for resisting Nazi policies, the Vatican's leadership refrained from open denunciations, preferring negotiation behind closed doors. As the war expanded, so too did the Vatican's shadow diplomacy. Documents from the British Foreign Office reveal meetings between high-ranking cardinals and Reich representatives in Rome, where assurances were exchanged. Silence on the deportations of Jews and reprisals against civilians, in exchange for guarantees that Catholic schools, churches, and property would be left untouched. Even more disturbing are the records of Vatican involvement in the so-called rat lines, clandestine escape networks established at the war's end. Hidden within monasteries and cloisters, forged identity papers allowed fleeing SS officers, Nazi officials, and collaborators to escape to South America. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile became sanctuaries, aided by passports stamped with Vatican seals. The same escape routes that once smuggled persecuted clergy out of danger now transported the architects of genocide into new lives of exile. Internal Vatican memoranda, some seized by Allied forces in 1945, reveal an uncomfortable awareness of atrocities unfolding across occupied Europe. Reports sent by Catholic clergy in Croatia documented the Ustaše regime's mass killings and forced conversions of Orthodox Serbs. These reports reached Rome, yet no public condemnation followed. Instead, the Vatican maintained a deliberate silence, seeking to preserve influence within the Axis-aligned independent state of Croatia. Survivors of these atrocities remembered the presence of priests who collaborated with fascist militias, their roles quietly ignored in post-war proceedings. The institution's determination to preserve itself, even at the cost of acknowledging genocide, became its unspoken policy. American intelligence files, particularly those compiled under Project Dana, catalogued Vatican contacts with Axis officials. These records were deemed too sensitive for public release, classified for decades under the pretext of protecting religious diplomacy. Yet when fragments were declassified, they revealed correspondence that blurred the line between negotiation and complicity. Messages exchanged with Reich diplomats were filled with vague assurances, subtle agreements to withhold criticism, and requests for guarantees of religious privileges. To the outside world, the Vatican presented itself as a moral compass. Within the archives, it navigated survival through compromise with one of history's darkest regimes. Why did the Allies suppress these revelations after the war? The answer lies in the Cold War. The Vatican was seen as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, its moral authority vital in the ideological struggle against communism. To expose its wartime dealings with the Reich would have weakened its credibility at the very moment Western powers needed it most. Thus the files remained sealed, their contents erased from public discourse. Survivors who spoke of Vatican complicity were dismissed as fringe voices, their accusations lost beneath the weight of official silence. Even today, the full truth remains elusive. The Vatican archives covering the years of World War II have been selectively opened, but many files remain sealed. Historians granted limited access describe documents abruptly ending mid-correspondence, records inexplicably missing, and pages heavily redacted. The omissions suggest not mere loss, but deliberate concealment. The moral implications of these hidden pacts are staggering. To acknowledge them fully would fracture the carefully constructed narrative of the Vatican as a steadfast beacon of resistance during the war. It would force an admission that silence, complicity, and calculated diplomacy played as much a role as prayer and charity. For nations that provided sanctuary to fleeing war criminals through Vatican channels, the consequences would be equally destabilizing. Argentina, long accused of harboring fugitives, relied on Vatican-sanctioned documents to grant entry to thousands. To admit this openly would rekindle debates about state complicity and international responsibility. Within Europe, countries such as Croatia, Austria and Italy would face renewed scrutiny of the Church's role in legitimizing fascist regimes and covering up their crimes. The Vatican's pacts with the Reich reveal a truth too dangerous for public conscience, that survival and influence were prioritized over moral witness, and that silence was traded for protection. These revelations do not erase the bravery of countless Catholic priests and laypeople who resisted fascism, but they do expose the duplicity of leadership that calculated its interests above all. The consequence is a legacy of unanswered questions, hidden archives, and survivors whose memories were suppressed in the name of institutional preservation. If these secrets were to be revealed in their entirety, they could fracture religious faith across nations, destabilize alliances built on shared histories, and ignite a reckoning within the Church itself. The Vatican survived the war intact, but the cost of that survival remains buried beneath redacted files and guarded vaults. And the world, still shielded from the full truth, continues to live with the consequences of pacts forged in silence and secrecy. Chapter 5: Secret Japanese Surrender Proposals Buried. In the summer of 1945, as Japan lay in ruins under relentless bombardment, its cities smoldering and its people starving, a series of secret diplomatic overtures were made. Messages that might have ended the war before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For decades, the accepted history claimed that Japan refused to surrender until nuclear fire forced its hand. Yet declassified intercepts, coded under the American MAGIC program, reveal a more disturbing reality. Factions within the Japanese government had already sought conditional surrender, months before the mushroom clouds rose over a shattered nation. These proposals, transmitted through intermediaries in Moscow, Stockholm and Bern, were known to Allied leaders. They were not rumors, but documented messages that could have spared hundreds of thousands of lives. And yet, they were dismissed, ignored, or deliberately suppressed. The core of Japan's proposal centered on one condition: preservation of the emperor. While hardliners in Tokyo clung to delusions of continued resistance, moderates within the Supreme Council for the direction of the war recognized that defeat was inevitable. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, working through Japanese Ambassador Naotake Sato in Moscow, sent repeated requests to the Soviet Union, hoping to use Stalin as a mediator, decrypted by American codebreakers. These messages clearly outlined Japan's willingness to surrender if its imperial institution was maintained. By July 1945, these communications had reached Washington. President Truman, Secretary of State James Burns, and military leaders were aware that peace might be possible without an invasion. Yet the Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26, demanded unconditional surrender, omitting any guarantee of the emperor's status. It was a deliberate choice that hardened Japanese resistance and silenced peace factions in Tokyo. Historians who later examined the magic intercepts were stunned by their clarity. One decrypted cable dated July 12, 1945, recorded Ambassador Sato's report that Japan was seeking peace with the greatest possible speed. These words never reached the public. Instead, official histories emphasized Japan's fanaticism, portraying the atomic bombings as tragic but necessary to break an unyielding enemy. The truth that surrender might have been achieved without nuclear annihilation was buried to protect the narrative of necessity. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was framed as a mercy, not a message. Yet within military circles, it was understood that the bombs also served another purpose: a warning to Stalin, a demonstration of American power at the dawn of the Cold War. The suppression of these proposals cannot be dismissed as oversight. Internal memoranda reveal debates within Truman's administration, weighing not only military strategy, but also geopolitical advantage. To accept Japan's conditional surrender risked a negotiated peace that might leave the emperor in power without total Allied dominance. More critically, it would deny the United States the opportunity to demonstrate its new weapon, reshaping global order with a single stroke of atomic fire. The bombings were not only about Japan, they were about the future balance of power. And so, the intercepts were filed away, their significance downplayed, their potential to undermine the official justifications silenced for decades. The cost of this silence was staggering. In the weeks between Japan's peace overtures and the atomic bombings, Tokyo and other cities endured conventional air raids that killed tens of thousands. The bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th added more than 200,000 deaths, most of them civilians. Even after the bombs fell, it was not their devastation alone that forced surrender. It was the Soviet Union's declaration of war on August 8th, invading Japanese-held Manchuria, that finally broke the last illusions of resistance. Yet the narrative crafted for public consumption omitted these complexities. The atomic bomb was portrayed as the decisive factor, the unavoidable choice. The intercepted peace offers were erased, concealed in classified archives. The consequences of this erasure extend far beyond 1945. By suppressing Japan's surrender proposals, Allied leaders created a foundation for the post-war nuclear order, an order justified by the belief that atomic weapons saved lives. This narrative underpinned decades of nuclear policy, from the arms race to deterrence doctrine. To admit otherwise would unravel the moral legitimacy of nuclear weapons, exposing them as instruments of demonstration rather than necessity. The fragile consensus that nuclear devastation was justified to end the war would collapse, destabilizing not only history, but the entire framework of global security. Japanese memory, too, was shaped by this silence. For generations, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki carried the belief that their suffering ended the war. Yet if their destruction was not necessary but political, their deaths take on a different meaning, not as martyrs to peace, but as victims of a calculated demonstration. Within Japan, the monarchy was preserved after all. Emperor Hirohito remained on the throne under Allied occupation. The very condition Japan had sought months earlier was granted after the bombs fell, raising the question, why were the bombs dropped at all? Even today, the full extent of these suppressed proposals remains obscured. Declassified intercepts confirm their existence, but crucial files are missing, destroyed, or still withheld. The reasons are clear. To release them fully would fracture the moral foundation of the post-war order. It would reopen debates long considered settled, undermining the justifications for nuclear weapons and exposing the human cost of political calculation. The truth, if acknowledged, could collapse the carefully constructed myths of necessity that sustain international power structures. The story of Japan's buried surrender proposals is not a footnote. It is a revelation with the power to reshape our understanding of the 20th century. It forces us to confront the possibility that hundreds of thousands died not to end the war, but to begin a new one, the Cold War. It demands that we question the decisions of leaders who valued demonstrations of power above human life. And it warns us that the greatest dangers of war are not only fought on battlefields, but decided in secrecy, hidden within coded cables and locked archives. The silence surrounding these proposals is not accidental. It is deliberate, and the truth, if ever fully revealed, could collapse nations built on the myth of atomic necessity. The war that ended in 1945 did not vanish into the silence of victory. It lingered, not only in the rubble of cities and the graves of millions, but in the secrets deliberately locked away. 5 fragments, 5 disturbing truths, emerged like shards from a shattered archive. Nazi scientists stood on the brink of unlocking atomic fire, closer than the world was told. Soviet forces inherited Japan's most grotesque biological experiments, carrying them into the shadows of the Cold War. Resistance fighters across Europe were betrayed, sacrificed in silence for political convenience. The Vatican's corridors concealed silent pacts with the Reich, prioritizing survival and influence over moral witness. And Japan's surrender proposals were buried, their existence denied to preserve the narrative of atomic necessity. Together, these truths undermine the foundations of post-war history. They remind us that victory was not pure, that liberation was laced with betrayal, and that the story of World War II is not complete. What remains hidden in sealed files and redacted pages may hold revelations still capable of collapsing nations. The past is not finished with us. Its shadows stretch forward, demanding answers, demanding accountability. The question is not whether more secrets remain, but whether we are prepared to face them when they surface.